Dark Souls 2 released recently, and being a big fan of the series, I couldn't help but jump in straight away rather than wait for the PC release. I've been playing for a while now and hoping that the game would grow on me more than it did initially, but unfortunately I've found it to be a pretty disappointing experience. Before I go any further though, I want to explain where I'm coming from. I've been playing the Souls games since not long after the launch of Demon Souls. From there I grew to love the game and love Dark Souls even more once it came out. The important thing is I played all three games the same way the first time through. I always played a knight, never summoned for any co-op, and never looked up a guide for anything until I completed my first playthrough. After my first playthrough, I would then go back in and explore the games further with different characters. In other words, I'm judging all three games from the same baseline experience. I also want to say, before I start talking at length about why I found Dark Souls 2 disappointing, that it's still a pretty good game. I'm being totally genuine when I say I would much rather play Dark Souls 2 than most games that have released in the past few years, but I also can't seem to overcome this feeling of disappointment. With all that said, let's start at the beginning. The first major problem with Dark Souls 2 happens less than a minute into the introduction. Rather than being booted directly into the character creation screen like the previous games, this one waits until after an opening sequence before asking you to make your character. This means the character's identity has to be hidden by their clothing until that point, but they do a really poor job of this since the character's build obviously looks male. Once you arrive at things betwixt, you can even take your clothes off and confirm it. Not only that, but there's an utterly pointless flashback sequence which also indicates the character is a guy as well. You could maybe pass this off by saying it's not a flashback of the player character, but in that case it has no reason to exist. It feels tonally out of place in the Souls series, which has always left the player character's history up to players themselves, and completely conflicts with any female characters. Normally I'd be the first person to argue that a game can benefit greatly from giving the main character a defined gender, even if only because of the amount of hassle that can be saved from not having to implement interchangeable pronouns or voice dialogue. Story-driven games usually benefit much more by focusing on other details, so it's unreasonable to expect every game to cater to both sexes in this way, but the Souls games had been doing fine at this up until now. In any game where I can choose a gender, I always play as a guy, but even so, this introduction was so pointlessly botched that I couldn't help but think how alienated I'd feel if I wanted to play as a girl. This whole thing feels like they went to the trouble of creating an FMV trailer and then had to find some way to retrofit it onto the game itself. After choosing a character, the old ladies then say,
"You lose your souls. All of them. Over and over again."
You can practically hear the developers laughing at your expense as she says this. They're basically saying, "We made this game really hard, that's what you wanted, right?" Now it's no secret that Miyazaki, the director of the previous two Souls games, wasn't brought back as the director for Dark Souls 2, but his insight into the previous games can still say a lot about this game. In practically every interview he's ever taken since the release of Demon Souls, Miyazaki is asked to comment on the difficulty of the Souls games, and the answer that he gives, over and over again, is that difficulty was never the point. The games weren't designed to be challenging just for the sake of it, it was a way to pull you into the world, and the peaks and dips in difficulty can be used to effectively set up a climactic moment, like the fight with Ornstein and Smough. It feels to me like difficulty was a big focus in Dark Souls 2, which is a crucial misunderstanding on the part of the new directors of this game, probably helped along with some pushing from Namco, who have enjoyed playing the difficulty card for marketing purposes since before the release of Dark Souls. As soon as you get to Majula, there's even a counter tracking the number of deaths. You can also go online and see a full breakdown of the ways people have died. The most obvious way this has been misunderstood, however, is with the boss fights. In Dark Souls 2, I got the impression the developers were asking themselves, how can we make this fight difficult? Whereas the question they should have asked is, how can we make this fight interesting? A good comparison is the Royal Rat Authority and Sif. The fight with the Royal Rat Authority is much more difficult, but Sif is far more memorable. Difficulty doesn't necessarily equate to a good experience even in a Souls game. One of the first images that pops into my mind when I think of Dark Souls is a giant, proud-looking wolf wielding an enormous sword while protecting the grave of his master. The Royal Rat Authority, on the other hand, is a retread of the Sif fight with 4 random enemies which inflict toxin slapped in front of it to make it harder. If you manage to kill the 4 rats, the fight is practically over, but unless you're a pyromancer, it's a crapshoot about whether you'll manage to get them all before the giant one mauls you to death. Similar problems extend to other boss fights, which seem to follow the mantra, if you can't make it good, make it difficult by adding more stuff. In Demon Souls, the Man-Eaters were arguably the ultimate spike in difficulty. You got partway through the boss fight and suddenly there was 2 of them. It was a moment designed to induce panic in most players since they knew their odds of making it out alive just dropped significantly. In total, there was 4 bosses in Demon's Souls which included multiple enemies, the others being very mild in comparison to the Man-Eaters. In Dark Souls 1, there was 6 bosses with multiple enemies, 7 if we include the Sanctuary Guardians in the DLC. In Dark Souls 2, the number of bosses with multiple enemies jumps to 11, 12 if we include Dark Lurker, most of which feel as lazily designed as the Capra Demon encounter. Rather than make the Freya fight difficult by giving her a challenging moveset, the designers just dropped some random spiders into the battle instead. The epitome of this lazy mindset is the Belfry Gargoyles, a copy-pasted setup except this time there can be more of them active at once. This all might have been fine except it doesn't play to the series' strengths whatsoever. The mechanics of the Souls games are built for one-on-one engagements thanks to its slow attack animations which are uninterruptible once they start, and a lock-on camera which focuses heavily on a single foe. Take the Prowling Magus fight for example. If you want to kill one of the crawling undead littering this fight, your eyes need to be taken off the casters at the back in order to lock on. From there you'll have 3 enemies shooting you at once, and since most actions aren't interruptible once they start, it's extremely difficult to know when a safe time is to start an attack animation without having vision of the enemy. The Twin Dragon Riders are another example of this. You want to avoid attacks from both of them while periodically damaging one of them, but in order to do so you need to lock onto one and position yourself in such a way so you can see the other. This could have been mitigated by better audio cues on the bow as it's loaded and fired, but this is seriously overshadowed by the music. I found myself having to repetitively run up and down the arena so I could keep both of them on screen, feeling like I was fighting the controls more than the bosses themselves. Even during engagements where the camera works well, such as the Throne Watcher, Looking Glass Knight and Ruin Sentinel fights, the gameplay suffers heavily from the multi-boss setup. You need an extreme amount of patience to get through any of these bosses in a safe manner. The only strategy here is to wait for both enemies to exhaust their entire combo at the same time before doing a single attack on one of them and then going back into defensive. If you dare to attack any of these bosses with more than a single hit at a time or while one of them is still active, then you'll usually be punished immediately. The main challenge in most of these fights is not losing your cool and doing something risky before the end. So really the reason half of these fights are any difficult at all is because they're so boring you want them to end slightly quicker by seeing if you can maybe get a second attack off before rolling away again. The variety in bosses is severely lacking, with far too many being oversized humanoid figures with giant weapons. They even often have similar movesets, with a slow overhead attack, a gap closer, and a 2 or 3 hit swiping combo. Attacks also lock on to an unnecessary degree, far more than in previous installments where enemies usually had movesets with their own weaknesses and strengths. When a boss goes to do an overhead attack, it will usually track the player up until the very last moment before impact, even if this means the boss has to spin around like they're standing on top of a record player. I can only speak for myself, but I was hoping to see less of this kind of stuff, not more. Bosses should have movesets which don't rely on tracking the player in such a cheap, simplistic way, and it's notable that big bosses in Demon's Souls and Dark Souls 1 usually lack this kind of lock-on, or only used it during part of the wind-up in order to compensate for their powerful moves. This was one of the things that set the previous Souls games apart from other titles, and gave the combat a better sense of fairness. It was also less problematic in those games since the boss designs were more varied. After my 6th fight with a giant armoured enemy with a giant weapon and the same basic moveset, I was getting pretty bored. Regular enemy attacks do this excessive amount of tracking as well, even when it's completely unnecessary. Take the turtle armoured enemies for instance. Despite their massive suit of armour, they'll follow the player 360 degrees on any of their attacks. The sad thing is these enemies have a built-in countermeasure for any player who gets behind them, so there's no excuse for them to be constantly facing the player. The challenge here should have been to try staying to the side of the enemy without getting too close to the front or the back. Instead, they just require the same tactics as every other enemy in the game. It's not just bosses that suffer from the mentality that more enemies somehow makes the gameplay better. The regular enemy placements fall into this trap as well. There's far more groups in Dark Souls 2 which automatically aggro together in clumps, forcing the player to fight against 2 or 3 difficult enemies at a time. Dark Souls 1 had a lot of mobs as well, but they were balanced around this idea. Mob enemies would have low health, lack a shield, or do comparatively little damage, sometimes all 3. Large or heavily armoured enemies in Dark Souls 1 were usually placed in positions where the player could fight them one-on-one, even right up until the very last area, because that's what meshed best with the core mechanics. Dark Souls 2 just haphazardly places massive enemies all over the place. Dealing with multiple strong enemies like this comes across as a hassle rather than an interesting fight, which encourages players to use cheap tactics instead of playing fair. In most cases, the AI is still easily abusable by backing off into a corridor and firing at range. This occurs so much I'm left wondering whether the designers thought this made for a good gameplay scenario somehow. As a melee character, you can pull back until the enemies start walking back to their starting point, leaving only one of them to deal with, and as a ranged character you can stand back and abuse the AI's inability to move into certain areas. This gets taken to ridiculous heights later in the game. If you ask me, King Vendrick should have just defended his kingdom by building more doorways. In the previous Souls games, part of the challenge sometimes was getting back to a boss after failing to kill them. If the level didn't open a shortcut or there wasn't a nearby bonfire, you had to traverse the level again and then make it to the boss in good enough condition to kill it. This was one of the things that drew people to the series in the first place, because it was challenging but still very fair. Now look at this path to Velstalt in Dark Souls 2. It's a single corridor littered with no less than 7 heavily armoured enemies. There's no sense of progress slowly making your way down a corridor by fighting the same enemy 7 times, so you're far more likely to just run through it. The same goes for the hallway leading up to the Looking Glass Knight. There's no point putting a bonfire next to a single hallway with enemies most players are simply going to run past. They might as well have just placed the fog door there and saved everyone the hassle. There's similar setups for the Lost Sinner, the Ancient Dragon, and part of the run for the Executioner's Chariot. This isn't level design, it's tedious, lazy, and frustrating. Despite having a much more heavy-handed and long-winded introductory sequence, the plot of Dark Souls 2 plays itself out far more poorly than in the first game. I want to quickly make a distinction though. There's a difference between plot and lore. Lore is the backstory of the world and all that kind of stuff, but the plot is what's happening right now, what the main character is doing, why they're doing it, and so on. First, I'm going to summarise the plot in Dark Souls. Last chance to turn back if you want to avoid spoilers. The intro video to Dark Souls 1 establishes all the major players, which will become important later on, giving us an idea of what makes them special and what their role was in shaping the world the way it is. When we start the game proper, we're told about the curse of the undead, and our character has been imprisoned for carrying the curse. Then, after some indeterminate amount of time, Oscar breaks the player out of their cell. Shortly after, we find Oscar mortally wounded and he asks us to fulfill the prophecy of the undead by ringing the 2 bells of awakening. When we arrive in Lordran, that's our goal. Once the 2 bells are rung, we have no idea what to do next, but this awakens Frampt, who says we need the Lord Vessel to complete the prophecy, after which he explains he's seeking a successor for Gwyn so we can link the fire. Linking the fire seems like a good idea, so we probably want to go with that. This carries us to the end of the game where we succeed Gwyn. There's more to it than that, but that's the gist, especially for a first time player. The intro video to Dark Souls 2 shows the main character dropping into some kind of whirlpool, because the old lady tells us we're cursed, and the only hope of a cure is to go to Drangleic for some reason. She actually says we'll have no idea why we're going to do any of the stuff we're about to do. Upon arrival we go to a shed and some more old ladies laugh at us. Then, after arriving in Majula, the maiden in green tells us to find the king. It's not explained why we might want to do this, but I suppose we can just imagine he has some kind of cure. On a hunch that the king has a cure, even though the entire kingdom is crawling with undead, we go and kill 4 powerful demons to open the Shrine of Winter. This allows us to get to Drangleic Castle, where the queen tells us to find the king. When we find him, he's gone hollow, so then, after some exploring, we go and talk to a dragon for some reason, and the dragon tells us to go into the memory of the giants for some reason, and this annoys the queen for some reason, so we kill her and take the throne for some reason. The pacing of Dark Souls 1 wasn't great after the Lord Vessel, but it did a lot more with a lot less when it came to its plot. Its introductory video set up the world and the major players very efficiently. I also think people underestimate how important Oscar is in Dark Souls. He's the one who kicks off the events of the entire game. Personally, I was never interested in the prophecy, but I wanted to honour the dying request of the guy who freed me, so it worked out either way. This is all the plot a Souls game needs. It seems to me that the new directors confused the obtuse nature of the lore in Demon Souls and Dark Souls with the plot. The story was never complex in the previous Souls games, whereas the one in Dark Souls 2 was poorly presented and unnecessarily convoluted, which left me without a strong sense of purpose for most of the experience. Even now, replaying the game, I have no idea why my character agrees to start wandering Drangleic, killing everything inside at the start. I wish I could say it was only the main storyline which was a step backwards, but nearly everything involving the NPCs feels like a sharp downgrade from the first game. In Dark Souls 1, players find and rescue more and more NPCs which head back to the shrine for a rest. Those NPCs are often useful to the player in some way, but the genius of it is they also often disappear from the shrine at some point too. Each character in Dark Souls 1 feels like they have some kind of goal in the world, and the fact that they move from the shrine brings them to life. It feels like their usefulness as a vendor to the player is secondary to their own goals. You're not the centre of the universe in Dark Souls 1 at all. Each character has their own little story they go through as the game progresses. This gives them all an air of believability and provides a satisfying sense of closure, even if that closure usually results in them going hollow. In Dark Souls 2, once an NPC arrives at Majula, they remain in the exact same location for the entirety of the game, and nothing of note happens to any of them during the entire playthrough. The worst example is the blacksmith's daughter, who sits on a rock just yards from her father and mentions he looks a little like her dad. Talking to the blacksmith reveals he's happy she's come home, and yet, no matter how much time elapses or how much you talk to either of them, nothing ever gives you the impression that the daughter has ever bothered to say one word to the blacksmith working just a little to her right, and vice versa. The most original thing the game does with any of its NPCs is turn the story of Patches and Lautrec on its head by making it more ambiguous and pitting them against one another instead of the player. This had me intrigued to begin with, but ultimately ends up disappointing too. Since they're busy with each other, it's hard to feel involved, and neither of them does anything interesting with you until the end of their story. I feel like this could have been great if the other NPCs had been able to compensate for this lack of interaction which was present in the previous games. In fact, I'm happy they didn't retread those Patches and Lautrec stories for the third time, but the replacement story isn't quite up to the task. At least this was quite original though, which is more than I can say for most of the other NPCs, especially Crestfallen Warrior III. I think FromSoft earned themselves some leeway since they were forced to switch from the world of Demon Souls to Dark Souls. It seemed natural they might want to carry a few things over. That's why I'm willing to overlook the appearance of Patches and the Crestfallen Warrior in Dark Souls 1, as well as the Maiden in Green in Dark Souls 2. The Crestfallen Warrior has already existed in this universe though, so seeing another character fulfill the same role with the same voice actor is really jarring. It really hurt my suspension of disbelief when all I could think about while talking to him was how coincidental it was to have the exact same character appearing again thousands of years later for no reason. The worlds of Demon Souls and Dark Souls were brilliantly realised because they felt internally consistent. You have to suspend your disbelief about magic and all that, but once you do, the world behaves in sensical ways. I'd credit this as part of the reason why Demon Souls became a cult hit in the first place. It does an amazing job of pulling you into its world. When I played the Souls games, I walked around cautiously, taking in my surroundings, and when presented with a situation where I had to make a choice, I would usually try to make the one that would realistically pay off. This wasn't solely because of the punishing difficulty of those games, it was because the world made sense, felt fair, and was totally engrossing. Dark Souls 2 simply doesn't have the same attention to detail as the previous games in this regard. The world doesn't fit together either logically or thematically. In Harvest Valley you can get a clear view of Earthen Peak and see the surrounding area. After beating the Earthen Peak boss, you then get in an elevator and go straight up about 15 more floors, arriving at Iron Keep. There's no hint of Iron Keep whatsoever from the outside of Earthen Peak. From Harvest Valley the sky is overcast, but in Iron Keep it has a red glow and the surrounding area is suddenly an enormous wasteland of lava. Similar transitions exist elsewhere. Going from the Tower of Flame down to No Man's Wharf makes no sense as this places the wharf somewhere below sea level. Going to the boss in Aldia's Keep reveals the landscape to be far below, but in reality the player should be more or less at the same altitude as Majula here since they've only walked up a few stairs. Even worse then, transitioning to the Dragon Eyrie reveals an obviously impossible set of outcrops in the sky which weren't visible just moments before. There's a host of smaller issues as well, such as the Tower of Flame as seen from Majula which is way out of position. As a result, the feel of Dark Souls 2 suffers heavily compared to the other games which felt much more consistent in their geography. Even worse than any of this is the Shrine of Winter, which makes sense physically but not logically. The player is expected to kill the 4 old ones or amass 1,000,000 souls before this will open, and all it does is circumvent a pile of rubble. A small pile of rubble blocks the way in the forest, so rather than climb over it, the character kills 4 of the most powerful beings in existence. I understand why they wanted Drangley Castle gated off until later, but this ridiculously poor level design shattered my suspension of disbelief so hard it never recovered. It might have died in Aldia's Keep anyway, where a bunch of creatures sit around in cages they're easily capable of demolishing. There were plenty of other weird, grating decisions made in other areas too, like bonfires which spawn you in range of enemies, especially problematic since the character starts out vulnerable when they're teleported back after dying. If you die to the Lost Sinner, then decide to take a break when the loading screen comes up, you'll be killed by the archers at the bonfire over and over again, losing all your souls in the process. Just across the bridge from there, they also made the genius decision to place an important vendor in a room with 5 exploding enemies. There's also the bonfire at Iron Keep which forces your character to go through Belfry Saul, because there's a small wall in the way. It's obvious that the level designers didn't have the same priorities when working on Dark Souls 2. I'd imagine the decision to allow warping right from the start of the game was made very early on in development, since every level is essentially a long tunnel leading to a dead end. I've seen some people compare this to the level design in Demon's Souls, but honestly that is an insulting statement to make about that game. Even in Demon's Souls, the levels were often designed to loop back around on themselves to provide shortcuts. They were usually presented in a very natural way which matched up with the style of the world. In Boletaria you unlock gates, in Stonefang you activate a lift, in Latria you open up locked doors. The level design in Dark Souls 2 is not only lazy because it provides an incoherent world compared to Dark Souls 1, but also because it has less interesting layouts than the levels in either of the previous games. Many of the areas look interesting and large from the outside, only to be totally underwhelming when you actually go through them. The Tower of Flame is a small path with one short divergence leading to an optional boss. Aldia's Keep has a nice entryway, then turns into a single long corridor with a few small side rooms. Dranglake Castle is a series of narrow, nonsensical hallways. Contrast that with the Castle of Anor Londo, which was by no means perfect, but actually had some rooms to explore like a castle should. The only shortcut I can even remember from Dark Souls 2 is kicking over a tree in Huntsman's Copse, which turns out to be totally unnecessary anyway since there's a bonfire placed right next to it. Even given the opportunity for a good, well-placed shortcut, the designers neglected to place one. The same bonfire in Huntsman's Copse is directly below the bridge which leads to the area boss. There could have easily been a ladder placed here to kick down in order to provide a shortcut, but apparently they would rather have you run all the way back around instead. Just think about how baffling this all is. Huntsman's Copse starts with a bonfire, then opens a shortcut directly to another bonfire, then neglects to open a shortcut to the boss area. Instead, there should have been only one bonfire at the start, and a shortcut placed at the bridge. It's so close to being designed the same way as the previous games, but just isn't for some reason. It's not just the level by level design which suffers in Dark Souls 2 compared to other installments, it's the accessibility of different areas and the placement of many items too. This is another reason why comparisons between the design of Demon's Souls and Dark Souls 2 are insulting to the former. In Demon's Souls, once the player finished the first stage of Boletaria, they then had 5 levels immediately available for them at any point. Each level had different pros and cons. There were incentives to go to any of them, except arguably the swamp, but even then the player isn't blocked from exploring the swamp if they wish. Item placement in Demon's Souls was carefully balanced to give each world a reasonably fair share of useful items which players would eventually be aware of for subsequent playthroughs. Dark Souls 1 attempted to carry on this legacy but did a somewhat worse job. There were several areas available right from the start, but not as much incentive to go to them. That said, the placement of items was still pretty well considered, and some players might opt to go straight through the Catacombs or Blighttown at the start to acquire certain items. In Dark Souls 2, Majula only opens into 2 locations at the beginning, but the sad thing is it actually connects to 5. The Grave of Saints, Huntsman's Copse and Shaded Woods are all sealed off until the player completes at least some of the other areas, or gathers up around 12,000 souls to buy the Cat Ring. There's no good reason why this should be the case, other than trying to ensure inexperienced players end up starting on the right path. That might seem like a harmless compromise to make, but the Souls games are supposed to be a refuge from the crippling accessibility concessions many other modern games make. Dark Souls 1 allowed you to wander into New Londo or the Catacombs at the start, and trusted you would have the intelligence to go somewhere else instead. Dark Souls 2 doesn't seem to have as much trust in the player. None of the 3 blocked off areas are even that difficult. I'd say getting through the Catacombs in Dark Souls 1 is more difficult than any of them, so it's frustrating that these areas, and the items they contain, are locked away until later for no good reason. This has an adverse effect on multiple playthroughs of the game since they all start out the same way. The layout of Demon's Souls, and to a lesser extent Dark Souls 1, allowed you to start a new game and quickly build whatever character you liked. Instead of carrying on this tradition, Dark Souls 2 railroads the player at the beginning and only opens up more later on. There's a serious lack of useful equipment in the first half of the game, which becomes doubly problematic since players are going to waste Titanite and souls on weapons they're not very attached to, simply because they don't have any other options. The Ember needed to ascend weapons is tucked all the way away in Iron Keep, which means at the very least going through the Tower of Flame, Huntsman's Copse, Harvest Valley and Earthen Peak just to snag the Ember. Never mind the other materials you might want for your weapon. The majority of Twinkling Titanite needed for special upgrades is only available once the player gets to Dranglake Castle, at which point they're most of the way through the game anyway. The overabundance of bonfires is another issue with the overall level design in Dark Souls 2. One of the greatest things about Dark Souls 1 compared to Demon Souls was its careful bonfire placement, which engaged the player in a game of risk versus reward. If you got far into a new area, you could usually make your way back to the previous bonfire easily to use your souls for leveling up, but that would waste more time than pressing onwards, so you were left with a dilemma: push yourself to go on, or go back and play it safe. This could lead to some very tense situations with a lot of souls on the line, and personally I can recall at least a few occasions on my first playthrough where the relief of finding a new bonfire was immense. That same feeling is hard to reclaim in Dark Souls 2 when all the bonfires are so close to one another. The Lost Bastille, one of the only complexly woven levels in Dark Souls 2, has 5 bonfires, 6 if we include Sinner's Rise, whereas places like the Painted World and Undead Burg only had 1 each. Not only this, but the way health in general is handled in Dark Souls 2 removes even more of the tension from the first game. In Demon Souls, players could farm healing grass off the enemies in Boletaria and carry around more than they would ever need. So in Dark Souls, the Estus system was introduced to stop this kind of healing abuse. The regeneration ring was also removed, meaning the only ways to heal were to use Estus, engage in combat successfully with the Ring of the Evil Eye, use up a humanity, or learn a miracle. This was one of the most fundamental and greatest improvements going from Demon Souls to Dark Souls, made for the very clear purpose of forcing players to take their health seriously. Even now, after playing Dark Souls 2 several times, I can't believe the new directors backtracked on this extremely important and well-reasoned change. It seems to me like they didn't understand the significance of healing in Dark Souls, in which case they should never have been placed in charge of this game. Dark Souls 2 adds in consumable healing items and a regeneration ring placed in a prominent location early on, which can be easily equipped on any build since there's 2 additional ring slots. In Dark Souls 1, a player on half health would have to consider carefully whether or not to use one of their flasks now, or wait until they sustained more damage in order to maximise its usefulness. This is a subtle gameplay mechanic, but one which adds a very welcome layer of decision making to healing and increases the tension of exploring. In Dark Souls 2 this has been stripped out. Damage at half health will heal gradually with the regeneration ring, and even if you run out of Estus you can always fall back to other items. After failing to maintain the major healing revamp from Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 2 attempts to make a major change of its own when it comes to light sources, and fails at this as well. I played Dark Souls 2 on the lowest darkness settings available, but none of the areas were ever as dark as the Tomb of the Giants in Dark Souls 1. On paper it's an interesting idea, asking players to forgo a shield in order to light the surrounding area, but it seems, at some point in development, possibly not long before release, the designers backpedaled on the torch system. This is evident by the sheer number of areas with completely useless lamps. The end result is the torch usually works backwards to the way it was intended. It's easier to explore an area in the dark with the benefit of a shield, kill all the enemies, then go back and light the lamps later just to make the place look nice. The few areas where the torch came in handy were a nice change of pace. It would have been interesting to see a few more of these. For every good gameplay change in Dark Souls 2 there's at least one step back. It's great that you can use multiple souls at once in the menu, but it's idiotic that the rewards from the crows are randomised. It's nice that the different rolling speeds aren't in 4 obvious tiers, but the addition of agility messes up rolling in general. With the amount of tracking the enemies in this game have, invincibility frames are an absolute must for the rolling to be useful, but the number of invincible frames depends on the amount of agility, so you're never quite sure at what point in your roll you'll be vulnerable. I'm willing to admit, on paper, this makes for a slightly deeper combat system than the previous games, but in practice it makes rolling less consistent and more frustrating. Paradoxically, the animations lack the weight present in Dark Souls 1, but nearly every action is actually far more clunky this time around thanks to the agility stat, especially at the start. The best thing I can say about this is at least it means adaptability is more worthwhile than resistance was. Soul memory is a decent idea, but executed incredibly poorly, making it worse than the simplistic level matching the previous games did. I like that they were at least trying to think of ways to stop twink characters from obliterating new players, but in doing so they made invasions even more rare, and now players can't do novelty builds just to play in certain areas because their soul memory will eventually get too high. All they needed to do here was change soul memory to reflect the total value of the player's level plus currently equipped gear. This would leave twinks out in the cold the way FromSoft obviously wanted, but wouldn't stop invaders from creating novelty builds which could permanently play in certain areas. The schizophrenic design of Dark Souls 2 seems to just change, fix and break things at random. To me this is all summed up with one minor problem with the Emerald Herald which irritated me to no end. When leveling up in Demon Souls, the Maiden in Black would recite a sort of incantation about souls. Anyone who's played the game for any decent length of time can probably repeat it word for word. The phrase, she says, appears when the player enters the level up screen, and as they think about their stats it continues to play in the background. The Emerald Herald has a somewhat similar phrase, which she recites, but it's all front-loaded before the menu instead of playing in the background. Forcing players to get through 4 sentences before they can level up is only going to build resentment towards a character they're clearly supposed to like. The bigger problem though is that this issue was already solved, and yet for some reason it's now implemented in a much worse manner. The way the Maiden in Black recites her incantation is a very elegant solution which had no reason to be changed. It's like the team behind Dark Souls 2 tried to mimic Demon's Souls without even bothering to go back and play it. While I'm talking about incomprehensible changes, I just can't avoid mentioning the small tweak they made to boss introductions. This little bloody screen thing that pulses at the start of these cutscenes is incredibly dumb. I have no other words for it. All I can do is point out the absurdity of it. Someone at FromSoft decided what these cutscenes were missing was some kind of bloody overlay at the start for some reason. Because of that decision, someone made or procured a bloody texture from somewhere, then someone else had to animate it to pulse at the start of the video, and someone else had to do the sound effect for it. The end result is a cutscene that looks far worse than it did initially. Again, my problem here isn't that I dislike it. I realise it's a very small issue. The real problem is that it was completely fine in the previous games, but got changed for absolutely no reason. When you stop and think about it, it says a lot about the way this game was designed. Nobody was looking for this kind of effect to be added to the cutscenes, but some people like myself would surely dislike it. They only stood to lose out by adding it, and yet they added it anyway, because they just weren't thinking. Somebody just put it together, and it made it into the final game without anyone examining what the game actually gains by having it there. If you had asked me before Dark Souls 2 released, knowing that Miyazaki had been replaced in his role as the director, what would be the most likely thing to be fixed in the next game, I'd have guessed the Covenant system. Turns out I would have been wrong. The most obviously half-finished area of Dark Souls 1 remains half-finished in Dark Souls 2, despite there being clear avenues for improvement. The Souls games have, for the most part, valued smart decisions out of players not just with regards to combat but also in NPC interactions and other choices. This is why it's valuable to try and get into your character's head a bit when playing. For example, when playing my knight, I decided not to attack anyone who wasn't hostile to me first, since that seems like the honourable thing to do and might avoid any nasty repercussions. Similarly, I decided it wouldn't make sense for me to join a covenant without having an understanding of what that covenant was about. I mean, if I came up to you on the street and asked you to join my organisation without explaining what it was, it would be a bad idea to accept my proposal. This is such a simple piece of logic, it's one of the earliest things we teach children. This was my chief problem with the covenants in Dark Souls 1, and nothing has been done to correct it in Dark Souls 2. Take the Company of Champions, for example. The player walks up to a big stone tablet and is immediately prompted to join the Covenant without any explanation. This could have easily had some text on the tablet explaining what the Covenant was about. Instead, you only get a vague description after you accept the first prompt. I go into the Souls games knowing as little about them as possible, which I definitely feel is the way they should be played. So for all I knew, I might suffer some harsh penalty for abandoning this Covenant, which meant it would be foolish for me to join it without having more information. The same applies to half the other Covenants in the game. Now, as I said, this was an issue with Dark Souls 1, I'm not going to ignore that, but the chief benefit of doing a direct sequel like Dark Souls 2 is the ability to fix up areas from the first game, which hasn't happened here. Eventually I would find out there are no consequences for abandoning any of the Covenants, which is another problem. The word Covenant has an air of permanence to it which isn't upheld by the game at all. Again, this problem existed in Dark Souls 1, but if anything, Dark Souls 2 practically encourages the player to abandon Covenants whenever it seems even mildly convenient to do so, since they can always easily rejoin. If you're going through one of the Bell Towers, you may as well just join the Bell Covenant to get a few Titanite chunks. If you want to go through the doors of Pharos without any hassle, just go back and join the Rat Covenant. I feel like the Covenants needed permanency, either by limiting them to one per character, or at least enforcing a strict penalty for abandonment. This would have improved the replayability of the game by giving each character a certain role in the world, and might have improved the longevity of the online as well by giving people a stronger attachment to their Covenant. Of course, all of this would be contingent on explaining the Covenants better and giving more noticeable long-term rewards, but these aren't demanding goals. As for the Covenants themselves, there are some other, more specific issues. One minor detail which has a drastic knock-on effect is the lack of a whole red-eye orb for invaders. Without whole orbs, there are less invasions overall. This means the Way of Blue Covenant will have fewer disciples, which means the Blue Sentinels have no reason to be summoned. I played as a blue sentinel for several hours, and was never summoned to protect anyone in the entire time. On the other hand, my time in the Bell Covenant was action-packed, and each kill rewarded me with a Titanite chunk, far more valuable than the rewards for being a blue or red spirit. This imbalance in the reward structure pushes more people to the Bell Covenant, further killing the other three. The way I see it, there are two simple fixes which would drastically increase the amount of activity in those three covenants. First, give the invaders and defenders whole eye orbs early on, maybe at rank 1 in the covenant. Second, change the way of blue covenant so the members don't have to waste a ring slot in order for it to be active. Nobody wants a valuable slot taken up on the off chance they get invaded, so they don't use it. If joining the covenant alone allowed the summoning of blue sentinels, it would make much more sense. The covenants in Dark Souls 2 are mostly analogous to the ones in the first game, but one which saw a major overhaul was the Gravelord Covenant, which has been replaced by the Rat one. I always wanted to love the Gravelord Covenant in Dark Souls 1, but found it inherently unsatisfying since you don't get to witness what's happening to the people you Gravelord. This seems to be what the Rat Covenant is rectifying, but it's gone way overboard. The Rat Covenant is a completely unfair and frustrating setup to go against. In the Doors of Pharos, players are immediately assaulted by a huge mammoth creature, a toxin-inflicting rat, and an enemy player, all while wading around in knee-deep water which restricts movement. This isn't a PvP exchange, it's a meat grinder designed for the amusement of the rat. Some people defend this by saying the victim loses nothing in the engagement even if they die, but this is a weak excuse. I don't judge my enjoyment of a game based on how much stuff I have in my inventory, I judge it by the things happening to me. Being pulled out of a level, into a load screen, only to be slaughtered by impossible odds, taunted by an enemy player and then kicked back into a load screen is a waste of time at best. Invasions have always tilted the scales in the favour of the invader, but this is going way too far. Demon Souls did this best, by giving invaders reduced health compared to their targets, and changing their character tendency with every kill, which pushed them more towards being a glass cannon. This covenant was almost a great idea though, the mistake was allowing players to directly attack the people they pull into their domain. Instead, the Grave of Saints and Doors of Pharos should have been loaded up with more interesting traps, and the rat should have had to kill the victim by triggering the traps intelligently. This would have made the covenant 10 times more interesting and fair. Fairness is something which is lacking a bit in Dark Souls 2 compared to previous installments. On the whole, it plays like the other two games, but there's less care taken to ensure each death is the fault of the player. For example, there's no way to know this door in Huntsman's Copse will get you attacked if you try to open it. There's no way to know this beam in the well will break if you land on it, especially unexpected since landing safely on stuff like this was possible in Demon Souls. This door in Aldia's Keep has no indication it's about to kill you either. This moment would be incredibly cheap in any game, but it's especially disheartening to see it in a Souls game which used to be known for being punishing, but fair. The worst offender of all is probably the windmill in Earthen Peak, which needs to be burned down in order to clear the boss room of poison. I have no idea how anyone is supposed to discover this without being told to do it by reading notes left by other players. The part the character sets on fire is clearly made of metal, and the level design here makes no attempt whatsoever to get players to light their torch. I suppose the saving grace here is that it's still possible to beat the boss even with the poison, but the point is none of it makes any sense. Nobody reasonably expects a giant spider to shoot an enormous and incredibly damaging laser beam. It's simple to dodge once you know about it, but it can easily catch you off guard the first time because it's so nonsensical. Compare this with the armoured spider in Demon Souls which can breathe fire. The level is a fiery mine, so you're probably expecting something fire-based. The tunnel leading into the fight forces you to be wary of projectile attacks, and the flame breath attack has a long lead-in with an obvious particle effect to signal danger. Another comparison is the Tower Knight and the Last Giant, which are night and day compared to one another. For the Tower Knight, the arena is incredibly spacious, and players are lured up to deal with the archers first, giving them time and space to learn the Tower Knight's attacks before having to deal with him directly. For the Last Giant, there's no such prep time, the arena is far more cramped, and his moveset consists of haphazard flailing which can catch you the wrong way for seemingly no reason. The Tower Knight fight is about as challenging as the Last Giant, the only difference being you're less likely to suffer a cheap death the first time you face him. It's not just bosses which suffer from these kind of problems. The mace-wielding knights in the Dragon area are perhaps the worst enemies in the entire series thanks to how stupidly unfair their moveset is. They seem to just reset their animations constantly without any kind of stamina. Even after dropping their mace on the ground, they have no recovery time before they're swinging all over the place again. Trivial for a magic wielding character, but insanely unfair for melee characters since there's no safe time to attack them. This is to say nothing of the sometimes wildly inaccurate hitboxes on bosses and enemies, which sometimes teleported me into a grab from several feet away. Some overhead attacks from the bosses leave me with the impression that the hitbox on some of their weapons is 5 times wider than the actual blade itself. Perhaps I should give FromSoft the benefit of the doubt on this. Dark Souls 1 suffered from some awful lock-on issues pre-patch. I'd like to assume a similar patch might sort some of these issues out, but the cynic in me says they're here to stay. Enemy designs in general are a big step down from Dark Souls 1. Nearly all of them are humanoids with similar movesets. The vast majority that don't conform to that style were all present in Dark Souls 1. Basilisks, wheel skeletons, giant rats, mimics and necromancers all originate from the first game. By comparison, Dark Souls 2 brings almost nothing new to the table. Even the exploding enemies are inexplicably human, when it would have made far more sense for them to be some weird type of fauna like the basilisk, especially considering the number of strange locations they end up in. I imagine the team have a lot of respect for Miyazaki, and it feels to me that crippled them from creating a more original experience. They probably didn't want to trample on the legacy of the previous games, so Dark Souls 2 ends up playing it very safe. As a result, too much of this game feels too familiar. The Gutter is effectively the 3rd time this kind of area has been done in a Souls games, and other areas like the Tower of Flame and Earthen Peak feel very reminiscent. Some of the bosses are outright lifted from Dark Souls 1, and the soundtrack pales in comparison. After beating the game, one of the first things I did was look up who the composer was, and I was completely shocked to find out it was the same person. The music in Dark Souls 2 feels so phoned in, with nearly every track feeling like an imitation of the Ornstein and Smough theme. That track in Dark Souls 1 was great, mostly because of the several different phases it morphed through, which lent energy and a sense of progression to the fight, but it's hardly representative of that game's music as a whole. Some of the other tracks were similarly bombastic, but lots of others went for a more sorrowful sort of tone, like the battles with Sif, Artorias, Gwyn, Priscilla, the Moonlight Butterfly and Dark Sun Gwyndolin. By comparison, Dark Souls 2 almost never breaks out of the mould. Velstalt is obviously designed to mirror the appearance and role of Garl Vinland from Demon Souls, but their tracks are worlds apart. I suppose this is all going to come down to taste, but I know which one I think is far more memorable. I'd say the same is true for the other music in general. Even the lesser tracks from Dark Souls had more personality to them, like Pinwheel and Seath. With the exception of the end boss theme, I found the soundtrack of Dark Souls 2 to be completely interchangeable. It's all perfectly serviceable, but if you ask me, that's a big step down. The music may be a bit uninspired, but that's nothing compared to the completely rehashed story, which is once again about linking the fire. There's a few reasons why they shouldn't have gone down this road for the second time. First of all, there's the fact that the ending to Dark Souls 1 has been trampled on by the mere existence of Dark Souls 2. In Dark Souls 1, you got the impression that the 2 different endings you could choose from were in complete juxtaposition. Thanks to Dark Souls 2, we have to admit that, at best, the Link to Fire ending to Dark Souls 1 is canon, or, at worst, the ending to Dark Souls 1 makes no difference either way. If anything, Dark Souls 2 seems to hint at the latter with its talk of cycles, which is a transparent attempt to create an excuse for the inevitable Dark Souls 3. Blindly reusing the same ideas has also resulted in a game where the story and the world don't match the theme. In the intro and NPC dialogue, there's lots of talk of forgetting, people losing their grip on their pasts as they hollow. This could have made for a really compelling theme, but the game itself does little to back it up. Dark Souls 1 was about the end of an age, which was possibly the end of the world altogether. They drove this home with the theme of fire that clearly encapsulates the message. Eventually, every flame burns itself out. The bonfires in Estus are obviously designed to evoke this theme, and pyromancy was spun off into its own branch of magic, giving them a reason to include more fire spells. The introductory video starts by talking about fire, and the game itself ends at the kiln of the first flame. There's no equivalence in Dark Souls 2 apart from the giant memories, which are extremely brief and come right at the end of the story. This game could have easily just taken place very far away from Lordran and had nothing to do with linking the fire or the undead curse. All the team had to do was get a bit more creative. Alternatively, they could have just not linked it to Dark Souls 1 at all. I mean, who's to say the Dark Souls games need to take place in the same world? Of course, all this means they ended up retreading the lore of the first game as well as the story. If you're anywhere as cynical as I am, you might have seen this coming. One of the earliest questions I asked myself after they announced Dark Souls 2 was how much Solera pandering there was going to be. I can't even begin to tell you how hard my eyes rolled once I read the description for the Great Lightning Spear and saw it talk about a grossly incandescent father. Solaire is one of my favourite characters in any of the Souls games, but he has absolutely no place in Dark Souls 2. We're talking about a time frame where nearly everything from the time of Lordran has been forgotten, but the one covenant which happens to survive intact just happens to be the same one the community won't shut up about. It makes no sense, and it's clearly just playing into the attachment people have to Solaire. You can even leave praise the sun messages if you want to run it even further into the ground. The last thing I ever wanted a Souls game to do was pander to people in this kind of way, especially since the games are known for their bleak atmospheres. Miyazaki fully expected people to like Solaire, but for the vast majority of players, he died a horrible death down in Lost Izalith. I might be giving him too much credit, but I always got the impression that Miyazaki had a lot more answers about the worlds of Demon Souls and Dark Souls than he ever gave anyone. Even if he didn't understand everything, he probably had a good idea what the backstory was for many of the elements which ended up being presented to players as mysteries. I got that impression because that's his style. He developed it to recreate a feeling he had from reading Western fantasy books when he was younger, and his English comprehension left him speculating about many of the details he couldn't understand. This seems like something the Dark Souls 2 team tried to replicate and simply weren't able. There's a big difference between having an idea, then ripping out a few chunks so that it looks incomplete, and building an idea to be incomplete in the first place. It's designed to bait people into drawing connections to Dark Souls 1 based on flimsy evidence. At best, I can say this slightly reinforces that theme of forgetting I mentioned a moment ago, but it left me inherently uninterested in the world of Dark Souls 2 itself, since it seemed too preoccupied with forming connections to the original. It's bad enough that Nashandra is connected to Manus, but New Game Plus reveals that the 4 old ones are connected to Nito, Gwyn, Seath, and the Witch of Izalith. Without Miyazaki directing, this game may as well be fanfiction, the difference being some fanfiction writers would have the good sense not to bring back the spirit of every major boss from the last game. So far, I haven't even mentioned the misleading advertising Namco participated in before the game's release. Personally, as someone living in Europe who ignored the pre-release info, this affected me a lot less than most people since I was in the dark anyway, and the controversy started before I even had a chance to buy my copy. Many in America weren't quite so lucky, and discovered the graphical downgrade the day of the game's release, after they had already bought it. The speculation about why exactly the visuals don't match up in the final release still runs rampant, and we may never have a definitive answer, but really the why doesn't matter much. How the game is presented to the public is the responsibility of Namco, and even if they did initially plan for the demo graphics to represent the final version, they should have had plenty of time to inform people before release by showing more accurate footage. Misrepresenting the product isn't an acceptable way to treat potential customers. I hope they learn their lesson for next time, and I certainly hope for more skepticism from the community until Namco earns that trust back. All that said, top-notch graphics were never a priority for the Souls games. The controversy surrounding the visuals has dramatically overshadowed the conversation about the game's other, more disappointing design decisions. The way I see it, the bait and switch Namco pulled is just the cherry on top of the heap of disappointment I felt with Dark Souls 2, not the other way around. Forgive the massive incoming pun, but honestly my biggest problem with Dark Souls 2 is that it has no soul. The gameplay takes one step back for every step forward, the atmosphere just isn't there, the story has the same outcome, and the lore is designed to be as ambiguous as possible. I'd have been happier had the team struck out with their own vision a bit more, or adhered more closely to the feel of the world in Dark Souls 1, but instead we're left with something stuck in the middle. Sometimes they tried to imitate the feel of Miyazaki's games, and at other times they went the opposite direction. On the whole, it ends up being nothing more than a bland, disjointed iteration on Dark Souls 1, which might have been forgivable had they fixed more of the issues from the first game. Instead, some of them are fixed, but new problems are introduced in their place, like going through 2 load screens just to level up. I'm not sure I've ever tried so hard to love a game and just been completely unable. I wanted to love Dark Souls 2 so much, but when I wasn't bored by the bland level design, I found myself frustrated by the repetitive, anticlimactic bosses. There were so many points where I asked myself why I wasn't just playing one of the other games instead. If you ask me, it doesn't even come close to being a worthy successor to Demon Souls or Dark Souls. The series has always had flaws, and Dark Souls 2 is no exception. Only this time around, the redeeming qualities are harder to see than ever. One of the central themes of Dark Souls 2 is forgetting. It's ironic, and quite sad, that I found the game itself to be very forgettable.